Sorry, can you move it?
I move that way.
Yeah, hang on. Yeah, go for it.
Mr. President, the motion highlights the recent power outages in Sydney, which were exacerbated by the fact that this organisation no longer has the requisite staff to be able to deal with the one of the basic necessities of life, and that is electricity provision to the people of New South Wales. And if you look at the nub of the resolution, which is asking that the House calls on the government to comply with its own legislated minimum amount of staff, and that's provide the legal amount, which is 3,570, and to give a commitment to no more job cuts. Mr. President, the issue of privatising electricity was a major one in the last election. It is well known the position that the Labor opposition took on this, along with several stakeholder unions, including the ETU and the USU and Professionals Australia. And notwithstanding the fact that the government won the election, there was a high degree of community angst about this policy. And it's turned out to be well-founded, Mr. President. I worked for that organisation for some 30 years, Mr. President, and I can never remember once the Army having to be called out to help with the restoration of supply. And if nothing else, that alone is emblematic of the undercapacity of that now privatised supplier to, as I say, restore supply within a reasonable amount of time. Now, there were people, Mr. President, who were off for over a week, and I've heard the government's characterisation of, 1 in 30-year events, catastrophic events and all the rest of it. It was a significant event, Mr. President, but I've got to tell you, I used to work for that organisation on the front line of supplying electricity, and we had many such events over the course of years, and I can never remember taking over a week to restore supply. We would sometimes take a couple of days, yeah, sure, but to have situations where literally thousands of people were off for over a week is simply unacceptable, and it goes to the byproduct of a privatised distributor. They have no accountability. The government has a 49.5% share, and yet the minister is seemingly powerless to do anything about it, because in private hands they are trying to return a profit to their shareholders. And if they're getting squeezed on the revenue side, guess where the profit comes from? By cutting staff, literally thousands of staff in the space of a few years. In fact, there was one stage, Mr. President, where that organisation, after amalgamation in the 90s, had something like 10,000 staff. They've got something like about 3,300 now. And is it any wonder it takes so long to restore supply? It's patently unacceptable. And what the motion does is ask the minister, they've still got a 49.5% shareholding on it. Presumably the minister's got an interest on what's going on in the board and what staffing levels there are, and whether or not the government's actually complying with its own legislated minimum numbers. When the sales legislation passed through this House in 2015 to privatise this organisation, part of the deal is that there would be job guarantees for 5 years. Those job guarantees expire in June 2020, but an internal Ausgrid document shows in black and white that they've actually fallen below that minimum legislated requirement. Now, you would expect, after the catastrophic events we've seen where people have been blacked out for weeks on end, that the government would be thinking, well, perhaps that organisation doesn't have the capacity anymore to restore supply to the citizens of New South Wales, and it's time we stepped into the fray and looked into this and make sure they are adequately resourced, because it's not good enough. We told you that privatisation wouldn't work. You said it was going to result in more reliable supply and lower prices. In fact, the exact opposite's happened, and it's taken 5 years for you to wake up that there's a problem. So the motion calls for the staff to be retained, no more job cuts, and to stick by the legislated minimum amount of 3,570. I put the motion.
Deputy President.
The Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Mr Deputy President, let me contextualise exactly what we're talking about here. After the months of horror that we faced over summer with the drought, bushfires and heat waves, many parts of the state were relieved to see some of the biggest rain events in decades hit New South Wales. The East Coast low that brought much of the heavy rainfall with it also generated one of the worst storms faced by our distribution network in 3 decades. On the 8th and 9th of February, our electricity network suffered major damage as a result of that storm. To put this in perspective, the storm has been declared a natural disaster, with Ausgrid recording a year's worth of rain hitting the region within 4 days. A year's worth of rain within 4 days, along with wind gusts of up to 107 kilometres an hour. The storm caused widespread damage to our networks, resulting in power outages to 140,000 Ausgrid customers. On the 18th of February, within just days of recovering from the previous damage, another severe storm, this time an electrical storm, hit our network. As many here today would have experienced firsthand, the storm brought with it about 74,000 lightning strikes between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. and wind gusts of up to 111 kilometres per hour. This storm caused about 800 hazards on the Ausgrid network, with the worst hit areas being the east and north of Sydney, the Central Coast and Hunter regions. The extensive damage to our networks required a massive clean-up and recovery effort, not only to restore fallen poles and wires, but also to clear trees and other debris preventing crews from accessing the sites. Crews from Ausgrid, other networks and our state emergency services worked tirelessly to clear the debris and to restore power to customers as quickly and safely as possible. Mr Deputy President, I note that this motion calls on the government to ensure Ausgrid has met the minimum legal requirement of 3,570 staff. That requirement is set out in the Electricity Network Assets Authorised Transactions Act, which requires Ausgrid to maintain appropriate staffing levels of 3,570 full-time equivalent employees. And let me say this, Mr Deputy President, Ausgrid has reported full compliance with its appropriate staffing levels and with the other employment guarantee conditions imposed on them. As at December 2019, Ausgrid has reported to our independent regulator, IPART, that its actual number of full-time equivalent employees is 3,950. Mr Deputy President, that is 380 employees above the legislated requirement, and that is why that this government does not support the motion.
Mr David Shoebridge.
Mr Deputy President, I rise on behalf of the Greens to support the motion and thank the member for bringing it to this House. We know what the outcome of privatisation is. We've seen it this year. The outcome of privatisation is reduced services, increased fees, and in this case, prolonged blackouts. For the government to stand up here and say everything is fine in Ausgrid is an insult to the 110,000 people who were without power for almost a week as a result of the inadequate support that they got from Ausgrid. Not only that, the piecemeal privatisation approach that's been taken by this government means, as I heard from members of the ETU when I was down on the South Coast recently, that when other utilities staff went to try and help out Ausgrid, because they've all been trained to different manuals and different procedures, they couldn't even effectively use the workers from Essential Energy and others because they're now going off on their separate little private ways and they don't have common procedures to restore power after a storm event. This privatisation move by the government has been disastrous and it has real impacts on people. There was the notorious and tragic case of a quadriplegic man in Sydney following those February storms, who was without power for 6 days, had no access to power for a series of life-saving equipment. He had his family go out and buy a $3,000 generator because of the failures of Ausgrid and the failures of privatisation. And he was just one of thousands of people who were failed by this government's privatisation agenda. And when he tried to call Ausgrid, they didn't ever return his call. He was left hanging on the phone for hours before being cut off. His messages online went unanswered. This is a quadriplegic man 6 days without power as a result of Ausgrid's failure, and this government tries to say that everything is fine and their privatisation has been great. It's been a disaster. More power costs, higher power costs, lower service, and in some cases, such as the example I've given, an almost deadly indifference to the needs of ordinary people in this state. I commend the motion.
Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I rise as Opposition Leader in this place and also the Shadow Minister for Energy. The real issue here is whether or not Ausgrid is properly resourced, and also the secondary issue about whether it has met its legal minimum guaranteed staffing level. In relation to the first point, the storms that hit Sydney were far from being the worst storms we have ever experienced, and there is no two ways about it. Ausgrid's response in reconnecting homes and businesses to their power was significantly slower than in terms of its response in previous years to like or indeed worse storms. How do we know that Ausgrid was struggling? Because Ausgrid itself asked the government to bring out the army to help them clear away the debris so they could reconnect the power. They made a huge public concession that they lacked the resources to do the job they were charged with doing. So that's the first point. Whatever the staffing level is, it's not adequate to the task. The second thing is about the minimum staffing level. The Parliamentary Secretary was very careful in saying that Ausgrid has reported full compliance to IPART. Well, let's just look at what the government has had to say about this. We have the Premier on Sunrise saying Ausgrid has more staff than before privatisation. Now, before privatisation, they had 5,600 staff. The internal document leaked from Ausgrid shows that as of December, it's got 3,288 staff, full-time equivalent. So the Premier lied. But then we had the Minister for Energy and the Environment, breathless on Robbie Buck's program, saying Ausgrid had 4,300 staff. 4,300 staff. I went to the IPART website and the figures were 3,950. Where was Minister Keane getting his information from? Presumably not from Ausgrid. This government was just making it up. But we know from the legislation that guarantees the minimum staffing that Ausgrid can claim to have more staff than it actually employs. It can claim its own staff as well as certain contractors who are permanent. Well, if you look back through Ausgrid's report to IPART, you'll see the staffing going above 4,000, way below 4,000, then up and then down again. In this situation, Ausgrid has defended its staffing numbers by saying we can count contractors that have been engaged for more than 12 months. The legislation doesn't say that. It says they can only claim people who work for it permanently. And the fact that the staffing fluctuates within given years shows that Ausgrid is misusing or not properly applying the legislation. On any reasonable analysis, its staffing levels have fallen below the mandated legal minimum. And we would call them to budget estimates to answer for this, but because they are majority privately owned, we cannot do so.
Are there any further speakers? In that case, the question is that... Oh, sorry, right of reply. The Honourable Mark Buttigieg. Didn't hear you, mate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Look, I just addressed some of the points that were made by the government, and I want to thank my colleagues Adam Searle and Mr. Shoebridge for their contributions. On the point about relying on other staff, Mr. President, there was a point in time where, in these catastrophic events, and my colleague Adam Searle's right, it's certainly, and I made the point in my opening remarks, it is not the worst storm we've ever had. I've got to tell you, I worked in those storms, and there were much worse storms, quite frequently, in fact, and we would get supply on much quicker than it has been. So the cop-out idea that there's been some sort of catastrophe that's unprecedented, 1 30-year event, is just not true. But in terms of Ausgrid relying on other staff, there was a point in time where you could call in people from Essential Energy and Endeavour. That capacity is no longer there because those organisations have been gutted too. In fact, Essential Energy, which your party, the National Party, did a deal with to keep in public hands, has actually been gutted under government ownership because they didn't have the minimum job guarantees. Notwithstanding that, Ausgrid has got the minimum job guarantees, but the internal document, which my colleague Adam Searle referred to, I'm happy to table it, Mr President, says 3,238 full-time employees. Total headcount includes ongoing and temporary project roles, EA, meaning enterprise agreement, senior contract and labour hire. Now, the inflation of those figures reported to IPART, where they're saying they've got 3,800 or 900, which is above the legislated amount, includes, as Mr Searle pointed out, contractors. Now, I've got to tell you something. Contractors who don't spend the majority of time on the network and actually shouldn't be accounted in the minimum figures do not restore supply. So when Ausgrid employs Lend-Lease or one of those companies to do a project arrangement on building a greenfield substation, assets, those people cannot be used on the front line to deploy to restore supply. So the fact is that we have the Premier stating that the numbers were greater than they were before privatisation, mistruth, patent mistruth, a storm where people were left without power for a week, and an organisation which used to be publicly owned and resourced no longer able or having the capacity to give people those basic needs of electricity. And then those horror stories about that poor paraplegic person being off for a week. It's not good enough. And unfortunately, the New South Wales people have to suffer now, and perhaps it'll turn into such a political issue that we might have to buy the thing back or intervene in the market to make sure that people do get the supply. It doesn't work. There is no competitive market in electricity out there. The only way to make sure is for the government to step in and ensure that those job numbers are there, so these organisations have the adequate capacity to restore supply. I commend the motion. The job numbers need to be retained and the job cuts need to stop.
The question is that of the honourable member, item number 438, outside the order of precedence. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. Believe the noes have it. The ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells.
I noticed. Well, in fact, remarkable.
Six, sorry, six.
Oh, happy day.
This is about your safe.
Oh, yeah, yours. Right.
Honestly. This time of night, very nasty. Yes, they are ratty. We've managed to return to a more even keel.
I'm going to be happy.
Got enough from my doctor. No, it's written in red crayon. It's the administration of justice.
Right.
The House makes issues our government.
Right.
So the issue is the elite particularly Ausgrid, already decided. So the things that have been coming to the administration of justice always involve matters leading up to a prosecution, or matters flowing from a prosecution, i.e. the administration of justice. So there's no procedure. Police
We're on the home stretch. I think so. You've got to have two. They're indoors. Like,
Two dogs.
yeah.
Makes them more trouble.
Yeah.
Keep each other company.
Cats can get weird. Cats can get like, I don't know one room's house. And, like, as in, no, the other cats. Oh, right. Yeah, you do this thing where it's like, cats can get like, what makes it actually. Sometimes they're just like, yeah, no, yeah.
Not that much fear.
Yes, yeah.
Ausgrid, look for the workers, mate. That's home, Lou. Wouldn't get that for It's more social democratic.
Fabian conference.
Indeed.
How you going, Fred?
Sitting in Fred's seat.
It's the longest in the chamber.
Oh, yeah. Lodge Warrior.
When they do this to my microphones. The Honourable Mark Buttigieg has moved private members' business item number 238 outside the order of precedence relating to Ausgrid funding levels. The question is that the motion be agreed to. The ayes shall move to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the opposition whip and the deputy opposition whip as tellers for the ayes, and the government whip and the deputy government whip as tellers for the noes. I think you're going to lose this one. There we go. Bit of a rut, isn't it, eh? Sorry. Yep. There being 19 ayes and 11 noes, the question is resolved in the affirmative. Unlock the doors.